Vietnam. In 20 years, it grew from a distant aggravation to a national nightmare. April 29, 1975, the final day of the Vietnam War. South Vietnam, our ally for decades, was disintegrating fast, its army in disarray, the Saigon government in chaos. Steamrolling toward the heart of South Vietnam, the communist offensive, in its path, a terrified exodus of South Vietnamese and almost 2,000 Americans trapped in Saigon. From Washington, the order came down, get them out now. In the final hours of the Vietnam War, America undertook a desperate and heroic mission under the most perilous conditions, a total U.S. evacuation, Operation Frequent Wind. This is the story of the fall of Saigon, of the final defeat of the capital city of South Vietnam, and of the life and death struggle to escape to America in the face of the enemy. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcast of a great TV news story, the turbulent end of a tragic war, America's final hours in Vietnam. From ABC News, great TV news stories with Ted Koppel, Frank Reynolds, Harry Reisner, Howard K. Smith, Tom Jarrell, Ken Kashiwahara, and the worldwide resources of ABC News. January 1973. The United States and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords. America's direct military involvement in Vietnam comes to an end. A ceasefire is declared, and U.S. ground forces are withdrawn. American POWs return home. America breathes a sigh of relief and tries to put the war behind it. South Vietnam must now fight the North Vietnamese alone. But peace proves temporary. Within a year, a revitalized North Vietnam resumes attacks on the South. By the first months of 1975, what had now become Hanoi's juggernaut offensive moved swiftly ahead. South Vietnam, weakened by waning U.S. support, begins to falter. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu and his government desperately trade land for time. As a result, the defense perimeter around the city of Saigon erodes. The day is March 13, 1975.
Almost exactly 10 years ago, the major U.S. involvement in Vietnam began. It began after the communists blew up an American officers' quarters in the Central Highlands capital of Pleiku. But the real reason was that U.S. intelligence said the North Vietnamese were about to cut South Vietnam in half, across the Central Highlands to the sea. Today, the Associated Press says the South Vietnamese have decided to give up the 3 Central Highlands provinces of Kon Tum, Pleiku, and Dar Lac. South Vietnamese officials are quoted as saying headquarters units and some Americans in the area have been flown out, and that ground forces in the area are going to try to fight their way east to the coast. It would be the biggest South Vietnamese retreat in the whole war, and it would abandon to the communists a long list of places where Americans died: Pleiku, Kon Tum Airport, Dak To. The South Vietnamese are quoted as saying they are hampered in supplying the area and that they will consolidate in more easily defended coastal enclaves. That was a strategy advanced in 1967 by General James Gavin and rejected by the American command and the Johnson administration. The story from South Vietnam grew increasingly grim today. Reports of new government withdrawals continued to flow into Saigon. The number of provinces abandoned to the communists or in the process of evacuation increased to 8. The latest additions are Bin Long, just 60 miles north of Saigon, and Tuat Can on the northern coast. The city of Hue, which is in that province, was reported today to be a ghost town. Meanwhile, there were reports that 5 more provinces are in danger of collapse, among them Tai Ninh province, which borders on Cambodia. Jim Giggins reports from the Tai Ninh-Saigon Road.
For the Saigon government, the news from nearly every corner of the country is bad. And the events here, not more than 25 miles from the capital, are a microcosm of what's happening throughout South Vietnam, which is to say, Saigon's enemies are pressuring Saigon's troops into pulling back on every front. Viet Cong soldiers cut this road from Saigon to Tay Ninh, and South Vietnamese helicopters did all they could to dislodge them. Despite South Vietnamese air power, the Viet Cong held on. Instead of giving up, they advanced, terrifying not only the civilians, but a good many government soldiers as well, who created a traffic jam of retreating army vehicles and troops. This road is the lifeline between Saigon and its forces fighting along the Cambodian border. Yet, the Viet Cong are everywhere. Those government soldiers and police who stayed behind formed a nervous roadblock to keep any unsuspecting civilians from moving into the battle area. Few wanted to go in when they saw hundreds were coming out. The question being asked now is how long can President Thieu, militarily and politically, take these losses? The Central Highlands now belongs to Saigon's enemies. Hue and the Northern Territories are tottering. Tay Ninh is under siege. The area around Saigon is secure, but that's about all. This is Jim Giggins, ABC News, on the Saigon-Tay Ninh Road.
In some of the areas further north, the communists appear to be aiding the withdrawal. There was one report that a communist tank force turned on its lights so retreating government troops could find their way at night. But in other sections, the communists were reported harassing troops and refugee columns. The refugee exodus continued today from the 3 Central Highlands provinces abandoned earlier. Frank Mariano has a report.
This group is part of 15,000 persons brought to the coastal area of Thuy under the protection of South Vietnamese troops. The military commander said they had come under sporadic attack by North Vietnamese forces all along the way. Many left so quickly, much of what they owned had to be left behind. Many families were separated. Now some had to share a hastily selected refugee camp with strangers. Coastal enclaves like Thuy and Nha Trang will soon be filling up. A 60-mile-long refugee convoy from Pleiku and other parts of the highlands is halted 20 miles from here due to bridges being out all along the escape route. There are said to be anywhere from 50 to 150,000 persons lining the road. Before the exodus from the 3 provinces is over, 250,000 people will have left their homes which they will likely never see again. Frank Mariano, ABC News, Saigon.
In South Vietnam today, the communists are reported to be in firm control of at least 7 provinces and are fighting for at least 7 others. There was fighting today only 35 miles from Saigon, where officials have ordered the city's militia into a state of alarm and readiness. In the north, there are reports that the old capital of Hue is 80% evacuated. The fighting has been getting heavier there. An estimated 40 to 50,000 vehicles of all types are reported on the road leading south to Da Nang. We have a report on the refugees from ABC's Jim Giggins.
The largest mass exodus in the history of South Vietnam is clogging the roads in the northern provinces as well as the Central Highlands. For tens of thousands of civilians in Hue, the handwriting is on the wall. The government cause is lost, with little left to do but to try to reach Da Nang and relative safety. As a result of the lightning North Vietnamese Viet Cong victories these past few weeks, day-to-day life in Vietnam is turned into a question mark. Hospitals can hardly handle all the wounded soldiers and civilians, victims of the Blitz from the north. The Saigon government doesn't even control all the main roads in the country, which means that a simple trip from one town to another often turns into a nervous waiting game, with the Viet Cong cutting the highway, daring anyone to pass. Some of the evacuees are Americans. This group, associated with a United States engineering firm operating in Vietnam, had to hastily leave Dalat as it came under North Vietnamese siege.
It's a very sad sight in Dalat. The people are along the roads and along the streets with all their possessions, waiting for buses or trucks or anything to come that they can load their few things on so they can leave town.
People are all worried, and my dad wants us out of there in case the enemy attacks.
The loss or probable loss of so much, especially symbolic cities like Dalat, has all but demoralized Saigon's forces. In the old days, they would fight for every inch of highway. Now, instead of fighting back, there is often little left for government troops to do but accept, for the moment at least, the enemy's control of some of their most vital territory. This is Jim Giggins, ABC News, reporting.
The Viet Cong have said they will negotiate a settlement with South Vietnam only if President Thieu steps down. But Thieu seems determined to stay in power. He said so again in a television address to his nation. ABC's Ken Kashiwahara reports.
President Yu told his countrymen during the television address was that he will not resign, will not accept a coalition government with the communists, and will instead regroup the army and take back the provinces that have fallen. Yu praised the fighting spirit of those units in central Vietnam, and at the same time blamed field commanders and the lack of American military aid for recent setbacks. Politically, Yu named this man, House Speaker Win Bak-kan, to be the new prime minister, while at the same time accepting the resignation of the old prime minister and the entire cabinet. Indeed, there has been evidence in Saigon over the past few days that Yu wanted to fight and not quit. Government banners and flags have sprouted up, urging the people and the army to stand fast, promising that the communists will be defeated. And if they didn't read the message, they surely heard it. Loudspeakers in the city center have been blaring words of encouragement to all who will pay attention, and the volume is such that it is difficult not to.
What it all means is that President Yu has refused to accept the advice of some of his closest supporters who have urged him to step down, and in doing so has dashed any immediate hopes for negotiations with the communists and may have caused a serious split within his own camp that may eventually lead to his downfall anyway. Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News, Saigon.
It all began on March 10th, less than a month ago, with a North Vietnamese attack in the Central Highlands. 3 days later, President Thu ordered withdrawal from the highlands, and refugees began flowing east toward the sea. The following week, 6 provinces fell to the North Vietnamese. 1 was in the north. The next week, only last week, 3 more northern provinces fell, and with them the ancient and beautiful, once beautiful city of Hue. In the south, another province fell. By the end of last week, the government withdrawal was a rout. Early this week, Da Nang, second largest city in South Vietnam, fell to the communists. By midweek, 3 more provinces were captured, and Quy Nhon, third largest city, was taken. This weekend, Saigon itself is imperiled. This last map shows the area held by the North Vietnamese up to today, but what it cannot show is the buildup of communist forces within reach of Saigon, estimated now at more than 250,000 and growing by some 1,000 troops every day. Just now it seems there are even more North Vietnamese in the Saigon area than there are South Vietnamese troops.
The Pentagon announced today that all 9 carriers of the 7th Fleet have left port and are sailing in the South China Sea, presumably standing by in case they're needed to aid in the evacuation of U.S. citizens. Officials say the number of Americans in Saigon has dropped from 6,000 to about 3,000 in the last 2 weeks. South Vietnamese forces lost Phan Thiet today, the 19th provincial capital that has fallen to the communists. The government now controls only the southern third of the country. And today the Viet Cong said it's preparing for an all-out attack on Saigon. Reports say 100,000 enemy troops have massed near the capital, outnumbering its defenders 2 to 1. The communists are testing those defenses with assaults on cities around Saigon. One of their targets has been Swan Lock. ABC's Jerry King reports on the fighting there.
The fight for Swan Lock has gone on for 1.5 weeks. There's not much left for the communists to take, not much for the South Vietnamese to defend. The city is 40 miles from Saigon. It is surrounded by the North Vietnamese and must be resupplied by helicopter. And there are still refugees who were caught in the city when the communists closed off the main road to safety. There are also North Vietnamese, dead commandos left behind after their attempt to capture the city failed. The Saigon government is still holding on to the city, but the cost has been high, and in the end, it may well prove to be superfluous. Further back Highway 1, the road from Saigon, government troops have been unable to dislodge the North Vietnamese and open the way to Swan Lock. In fact, they themselves are slowly being pushed back toward the capital. Just down this road, the South Vietnamese forces regrouped once again and were trying to fight off the advancing North Vietnamese. There was a lot of small arms fire and close-in combat with communist troops only a few hundred yards away. It got so hot and heavy that the command armored personnel carrier withdrew from the front lines and set up a little further back. From there, it directed many rounds of incoming government artillery. The South Vietnamese army is contesting every inch of terrain along these fields, but inch by inch it is being pushed back Whatever happens here, most military analysts are agreed. The Saigon command is only buying time. Jerry King, ABC News, in the fields near Highway 1, South Vietnam.
I'm Dick Carlson in Los Angeles. The South Vietnamese military command has ordered its troops to abandon the provincial capital of Xuan Loc. The battle for the city, only 38 miles from Saigon, was considered a key to the capital's defense. Its fall left gaping holes in the northeastern flank of Saigon's defenses. Xuan Loc is the 21st provincial capital to fall in the current communist offensive. The threat of an all-out attack has brought the war home to the people of Saigon. ABC's Jim Giggins reports.
This has always been a deceiving city. Even in the worst of times, life and death appear to continue with their normal rhythm. But underneath, there's a growing panic that could shatter the city's facade at any moment.
There's an apathy showing up. There's an indifference in some people, and in a lot of other people, there's a sense of panic developing. Every day now, I meet friends who start talking about themselves or members of their family carrying poison. And this is intended for, if the other side takes over, that they'll use it to commit suicide.
The Vietnamese government has always refused to issue its citizens passports unless they are very rich or influential. Consequently, they cannot leave the country. And this is one of the reasons there is so much desperation. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese frantically want out, and there's apparently no way. Is it difficult to get a passport for your wife's Vietnamese relatives?
It's impossible today. You can take a chance on buying them. They sell anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000. And there's no guarantee that once you have that you're still going to be able to get on the plane.
The government knows a large segment of the population is desperate. The police have responded by subtly increasing the patrol along the rivers and sea to keep people from trying to escape the country. The airport, always off limits, is more heavily guarded than usual. And the word has gone out that any unauthorized plane taking off might possibly be shot down. What a good many Vietnamese are hoping for is that the United States will intercede and put pressure on President Thieu into letting those Vietnamese out now who feel they would simply not be welcome were the other side to march into Saigon. America so far has put very little pressure, and the resulting tension mounts higher every day. This is Jim Giggins, ABC News, Saigon.
President Thieu spoke to his nation today, announcing in a bitter, tearful, rambling 90-minute address that he is quitting. South Vietnam cannot win militarily, he said, and he blamed the United States. Thieu read a letter, he said, had been written by President Nixon in 1973, promising all necessary aid to South Vietnam if it would sign the Paris Peace Accords. But the Paris Agreement, Thieu said, led the South Vietnamese people to death. The Americans promised us, Thieu said, and we trusted them. And of Secretary of State Kissinger, he said, I never thought a man like Mr. Kissinger would deliver our people to such a disastrous fate. Thieu said his resignation would, quote, let the United States give Vietnam aid and open the way for negotiations. Of his own future, Thieu said nothing. While the situation in Vietnam has worsened, U.S. naval forces have been moving into the South China Sea to help with a last-minute evacuation attempt if one should become necessary. ABC's Jerry King reports.
The American fleet in Southeast Asia is 40 miles off the coast. There was the attack carrier Midway, one of the 5 aircraft carriers assigned to the area. Its location was only 100 miles from Saigon. Further along, there was the Hancock, a helicopter carrier. Then we flew past the Okinawa. Like the Hancock, one of the carriers which only last week was used in the evacuation of Phnom Penh. ABC News counted between 15 and 20 American warships steaming off the coast. They seem to be patrolling back and forth, presumably awaiting word from the Pentagon if they are needed for the evacuation of the more than 3,000 Americans still in Vietnam. An evacuation is tangible evidence for the South Vietnamese that the collapse of their country is considered near. Jerry King, ABC News, over the South China Sea off South Vietnam.
Here in Washington, President Ford told congressional leaders this morning that by nightfall, only about 1,500 Americans, what Mr. Ford called the barest minimum number, will be left in South Vietnam. The question remains, what happens to those 1,500 and perhaps to tens of thousands of Vietnamese who may want to leave Saigon? ABC diplomatic correspondent Ted Koppel reports.
Publicly, officially, the administration is taking the position that many, possibly even most of those 1,500 Americans are going to remain behind in Vietnam to help the new Saigon government obtain a peaceful settlement. Privately, the problem is spelled out much more bluntly. Evacuation plans for the last remaining Americans have to be formulated without sparking panic in Saigon. But contingency plans have already been made, and the number of Americans remaining now has almost reached a point at which everyone could be lifted out in the course of one swift operation that would take less than a day. The prospects for evacuating large numbers of Vietnamese, however, appear to be fading. Republican Senator John Tower of Texas addressed himself to that question, having been briefed this morning at a GOP leadership meeting at the White House by top administration officials.
The administration probably is looking realistically at the matter now and is thinking only in terms of what is possible.
This is just a few thousand, is it not?
In my view, it'd be just a few thousand. I wouldn't be able to specify numbers, but I would reckon it in the thousands rather than in the tens of thousands.
The key question now is whether a major battle for the city of Saigon can be avoided. If it can, and Secretary Kissinger believes the chances are only slightly better than even, then the orderly evacuation of tens of thousands of Vietnamese could still be worked out. But barring a negotiated ceasefire with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, the most the administration expects to accomplish now is the safe withdrawal of all Americans, together with a few hundred Vietnamese who could be airlifted out at the same time. This is Ted Koppel, ABC News at the State Department.
The fighting in South Vietnam was down to near zero today, while the flow of refugees out of the country sharply escalated. Efforts were underway in Saigon to form a new government that could negotiate with the communists with the name of General Duong Van Minh, Big Min, prominently mentioned. With the communists poised for a final move on Saigon just about at will, the lull has increased speculation that something has been or is being worked out behind the scenes. But others believe the lull, which is now in its fourth day, is beginning to get ominous. ABC White House correspondent Tom Jarrell reports.
The lull has gone about as long as we could imagine. I have a gut feeling something is about to change. That view was expressed today by a U.S. Vietnam expert who believes it's possible that a surrender or be attacked ultimatum could be issued by the North Vietnamese against the Saigon government within 24 hours. Such a rumor is already circulating in Hong Kong, but U.S. officials say they can find no solid basis for it. The 4-day pause after the North Vietnamese have encircled Saigon has the earmarks of a period of frantic behind-the-scenes diplomatic negotiations aimed at avoiding a final battle for the capital. The Saigon government's moves to put General Big Min back in power is described by one U.S. official as the maximum Saigon can go to prove to the other side that you are ready to quit. The North Vietnamese have not tried to attack the U.S. evacuation airlift, and in an apparent signal back, President Ford has said the United States' role is over in Vietnam. When questioned today about U.S. North Vietnamese diplomatic contacts, the president's spokesman would only say the subject is too delicate, too sensitive to discuss. Tom Jarrell, ABC News, Washington.
These Americans and their Vietnamese dependents are terrified of what the communists will do to them and their children if they take Saigon, because they've all worked for the Americans at one time or another, or so they claim. Now they're using their American connection, however tenuous, to try to qualify for the U.S. airlift. Some of them make it. Most of them don't. The lucky ones are usually the children. Nick Lally is a bachelor, an American aircraft technician who's lived in Saigon for the past 9 years. A few days ago, the widowed mother of Nguyen Thi Yut, a little girl who used to deliver his newspapers, came and begged him to adopt her child and get her out of Vietnam. Suddenly, at the age of 55, with a heart condition and no fixed address, he's a father. There are hundreds of Vietnamese out at Saigon's Tan Son Nhut airport who camp here in the hope that some American somehow might be able to get them out. If not them, their children. With the communist forces a few miles away, they believe that they are all living on borrowed time.
Well, be happy, smile. Let me see you smile. Big one. Give me a big one. Give me a kiss.
Hillary Brown, ABC News, Saigon.
Viet Cong forces shelled the center of Saigon in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday. It was the first time in over 2 years that's happened, and apparently meant as a reminder that the communist forces can strike the city at will. At least 6 people were killed in the attack. The Saigon government is trying to prevent an all-out assault on the capital this weekend if peace efforts fail. The prospect for Saigon is very grim indeed, as ABC's Hillary Brown reports.
This is the route that the North Vietnamese army would take for an assault on Saigon from the north. Now they seem to be moving closer to the capital, poised for the strike. The South Vietnamese army are so outnumbered and outflanked now that even if they fought hard, they'd be overrun in a couple of days. Clear that the communist forces are keeping up a steady pressure on the receding government defense line in the north, where they have at least 2 divisions against 1, and where every day South Vietnamese armor and men are withdrawn for regrouping. At the 25th Division headquarters at Chu Chi, north of Saigon, new recruits go through a crash training program. The course is usually 3 months, but they've cut it to 8 weeks now. Soon they'll be rushed to the northern front, if it's still there. Hillary Brown, ABC News, 30 miles north of Saigon. This scene at Newport Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon is the proof, if any proof is needed, that the communist forces are finally closing in on the capital. A communist commando unit, probably Viet Cong, has slipped into Saigon and dug itself beneath this American bridge over the Saigon River. They're equipped with grenades, anti-personnel bombs, and AK automatic rifles. Above them, South Vietnamese helicopter gunships circle and fling down their salvo of rockets. While soldiers on the bridge hammer away at them with machine guns and mortar. Much of the American commissary on the other side of the bridge was destroyed in this fighting. An undisclosed number of soldiers were wounded and killed. The communist commandos seemed to fire at anything that moved on and around the bridge, including this small corps of newsmen and women who were foolish enough to get themselves caught in the crossfire. For us, it seemed a good place not to be. Unless something happens very quickly on the political front here, there's every indication that the Battle of Saigon may be about to begin. The soldiers behind me are firing at Viet Cong units who are 500 yards away, no more. This is the closest the fighting has ever come to Saigon since the communist offensive in 1968. Lori Brown, ABC News, Saigon.
The day is April 29, 1975. The final North Vietnamese drive, called the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, proves unstoppable. Within the city of Saigon, fear of communist retribution mounts to near hysteria. When rocket attacks kill 2 Americans, President Gerald Ford orders the final evacuation of the remaining U.S. community of security troops, diplomats, intelligence agents, and their Vietnamese support staff. 6 years later, Tom Jarrell reconstructs America's final hours in Vietnam. Preparing his report, Jarrell interviews eyewitnesses and participants ranging from members of the press corps to the President of the United States, from Southeast Asia to Washington, D.C.
In Washington, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, together they directed the last day from the Situation Room in the basement of the White House. In the military, General Richard Carey, the highest-ranking officer on the scene during the evacuation. Major Jerry Berry, the helicopter pilot who logged over 18 hours straight during that last day. Sergeant Juan Valdez, a Marine security guard, the last American to evacuate Saigon. Sergeant Carl Richardson, helicopter crew chief. And Sergeant Raymond Cato, chopper maintenance man. In the press, correspondent Ken Kashiwahara, ABC's last man in Saigon. Jim Laurie, the only American television correspondent to stay in Vietnam after the evacuation. He went back for this 2020 story. Dirk Halstead, Time magazine photographer on assignment in Saigon. David Kennerly, the official White House photographer during the Ford administration. And at the beleaguered American embassy in Saigon, Ken Moorfield, brought to Vietnam as the ambassador's personal aide and put in charge of setting up a formal evacuation center. Denise Pham, a radio disc jockey known as Mother Vietnam, employed as a propagandist by the U.S. Embassy. Frank Snepp, the CIA's chief political analyst in Saigon. And Graham Martin, a career diplomat, whose toughest assignment wound up being the highly controversial ambassador to Vietnam. Finally, Vietnamese who tried to get out but were not evacuated. Phan Tran, a social worker employed by the U.S., and Nguyen Van Hein, an English teacher.
The last day we were in Saigon, April 29th, 1975, was one of the most chaotic of my life. I was blown out of bed as the communists began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base.
The North Vietnamese finally let loose with full force. A massive rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut Airport. By morning, whole sections of the airbase were in flames. Planes and buildings burned out of control. And 2 Marines, Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge, were killed at the compound gate. Their deaths rang the alarm bell in Washington, half a world away, where the president was in the middle of meeting with his energy advisors.
Kissinger rushed into his office, said that some American Marines had been killed at Tan Son Nhut. The president then said, "That's it."
President Ford called an emergency session of the National Security Council, at which he ordered the evacuation fleet to be placed on standby, and that Ambassador Martin give him a personal recommendation on what course he should take.
It was a very tense time, and everybody was just totally on edge.
The president then went to the second-floor residence to have a martini and wait for that status report. There would be an uneasy 2-hour delay, waiting for Martin to make contact. Meanwhile, at Tan Son Nhut, security had broken down completely by the time Ambassador Martin finally arrived to see the damage for himself.
There no longer existed any uniform discipline on the airport.
Looters were tearing apart whole sections of the airbase. At 10:48 a.m. Saigon time, Martin realized there was only one way out.
I called Secretary Kissinger and asked him to inform the president of my recommendation that we not try to proceed further with the fixed-wing evacuation.
Kissinger instantly telephoned the president, who at 10:50 p.m. Washington time gave the order to evacuate by helicopter. 1 minute later, frequent wind was radioed over the command channels. Correspondent Jim Laurie was one of many who then learned the evacuation had begun.
There had been a prearranged signal for the evacuation. It had been disclosed to those in the American community that when the evacuation was imminent, the song White Christmas would be played on the American FM radio station.
That was the signal that they were to start assembling and that the evacuation was commencing.
There were perhaps 200 or 300 journalists and others here at this site. We had heard reports that North Vietnamese were all around the city and they could move in and take the city any time.
When I showed up down there, I guess most of the people from Time Life were there. NBC, ABC, UPI, and AP.
Army buses pulled up, driven by U.S. Marines, fully armed, and each bus was packed with Americans.
A lot of Vietnamese began to gather on the street across from us, and it was deathly quiet. We were all standing out there with our bags and typewriters and cameras. And it was obvious we were going to go somewhere. And the Vietnamese obviously knew that we were going to go somewhere. And they looked at us, and we looked at them, and there was a lot of looking down at the ground about that point.
Forced to leave much of their equipment behind, the journalist hurriedly boarded the buses.
The bus started off through the back streets of Saigon, and we pulled up behind the embassy.
In all the confusion, the press bus, which was supposed to have headed directly to Tan Son Nhut, made an unplanned stop at the American embassy.
We were behind the embassy itself, and when people became aware that the bus that was next to the wall had Americans on it, they figured this was a way that they could get out. And people started to bang on the sides of the bus. And they had wire netting on the windows to make sure no grenades were thrown in. And people were hitting on that bus so hard that after a while the netting became covered with blood from people's hands. And finally the Marine who was running the bus said, "Well, let's get out of here."
Meanwhile, at Saigon's port, getting on a separate evacuation bus, was ABC correspondent Ken Kashiwahara.
As we were pulling out of the port, a Vietnamese man holding a baby ran alongside, and he shouted to us inside. He said, "Take my baby, take my baby, please." But at that point, he tripped and fell, and the baby fell under the wheels of the bus, and the bus ran over the baby.
All that day at Saigon's port, Vietnamese were desperate, cramming themselves on barges or in a flotilla of smaller boats that headed out into the rough waters of the South China Sea to awaiting American ships. Back on land, as different evacuation buses headed toward the airport, they were faced with one final obstacle. Vietnamese guards at the gate of Tan Son Nhut refused to let them pass.
The Marines decided they would just rush the gate. They rammed through the gate, managed to get onto the base. You could see black smoke coming up from the Air America facility. Some rockets started to come across the top of the buses. The soldiers got everybody out of the buses, told everybody to bend down low and run into the Defense Attaché's building. All of a sudden, we could see the F-4s come in. They began to rocket the North Vietnamese position.
We flew directly into the DAO compound and started to set up for business.
We saw the first helicopters come in, the Jolly Greens, very big Chinooks. They came into this area right next to the DAO. Back ramp went down, Marines came running off.
Being a crew chief, I'd be up front, and I'd be, waving the people in. And then the first mech would be out the ramp, helping the people up, pushing them in.
People have been told they're only going to be allowed to have one bag apiece. People would wear 3 and 4 suits, trying to get as much as they possibly could out.
People crowded in, and they just want to pick their own spot. That's no way, just get up there, you have to get up there. Sometimes, you'd almost have to step on people so you could get out there and get the people in.
The minute they would get one helicopter full, another helicopter would come in, take its place, Marines would come running out, go into defensive positions, and the process would start all over again.
Even with machine gun cover from overhead, by mid-afternoon, Marines at the airport could no longer contain the crowds. So it was decided to shift the evacuation to the more protected American embassy. Jim Laurie, who had decided not to evacuate with the others, watched the shift from the roof of the Caravel Hotel.
Right behind me, we looked out and we saw the helicopters come in from the South China Sea and pick up people on the roof.
I think I was the first airplane in, first Marine Corps helicopter into the embassy compound. We'd come in over the left side of the building and then drive it in on top of the roof.
Juan Valdez was a Marine guard at the embassy.
I was roving around from place to place. At one time, I found myself at the ground floor at the parking lot with those people, and at other times, I would go up to the roof and see how that evacuation was going on.
The Marine ground forces were actually in charge on the roof. They were bringing people up through the hatch, and it'd be a matter of a couple minutes, and you'd be fully loaded with anywhere between 15 and 25 people and ready to go.
All afternoon, choppers landed on the rooftop and in the secure compound below, where yellow flares were used to direct the pilots into the landing zone. Automatic rifles were carried by most of those helping with the evacuation, but handguns were taken from the evacuees themselves and tossed into the embassy swimming pool, around which people stood patiently, consolidating suitcases and awaiting their turn on one of the incoming helicopters that would fly them to the safety of an American ship.
Different helicopters went to different ships. As soon as they would set down, the evacuees would run off. The helicopters would be refueled, and they would take off again.
Also flying out to American ships offshore in the South China Sea were small Vietnamese planes and helicopters. Their pilots and crews were fleeing to the U.S. warships for safety at any cost. But none of the Vietnamese pilots could figure out the landing patterns, and they refused to make radio contact.
The air boss is saying, "Please, somebody talk to me." South Vietnamese aircraft are not listening to anybody, and they've got full loads of people on board these aircraft. And they're coming in no matter which way they can get in, as long as they can get on the flight deck. The people jumped off the aircraft and just left the aircraft turning.
The Vietnamese choppers kept coming. Soon they took up so much room on board the U.S. ships, there was only one solution.
We had to throw all of them off the side because we didn't have room for them, because our aircraft were coming in for fuel. 15, 20 people grabbed the nose and rolled it right off the side while the ship was underway. You get a lot of enjoyment in throwing these helicopters over the side because, nobody's in them. And it's a lot of fun to watch how they look when they're sinking. As long as you're not in it.
Other Vietnamese pilots, after dropping off their passengers and being thoroughly frisked themselves, flew their helicopters off the side of the ship and ditched their aircraft in the sea, jumping out at the last possible moment. Again and again, pilots unloaded their choppers this way. And as risky as it was better than the alternative, flying back to Vietnam. Only one crash occurred that wasn't intentional during the evacuation. An American helicopter went down, killing William Neistel and Michael Shin, the last Americans to die in Vietnam. Back at the American embassy, classified documents were being shredded and bagged. At one point, those bags broke open, and the chopper blast sent the paper flying.
We destroyed some of the last files on that last day. All of them were destroyed before we left.
We had an abundance of weapons there. Anything from pistols to shotguns to carbines, M16s, and they were getting ready to blow up these weapons, right in the embassy compound.
All around the building, there were thousands of Vietnamese who had gathered, most of them desperate to get out.
Among those who were not evacuated that day was Phan Tron.
People crowded around the building, thousands and thousands of them. They even been crushed or they've been stepped over. And I don't want to be killed that way.
I didn't get in. I myself didn't get in because, but I didn't even get close to the gate either.
Their documentation, I could tell, just in looking at them through the gates, was adequate and sufficient. But we couldn't run the risk of opening the gates and letting in a flood of hundreds.
The gates were open once during the day when Ambassador Martin left the compound to pick up his wife.
I wanted to go back to my residence to give my wife sort of 11 minutes to pack one bag and then to be evacuated from the compound. Although we attempted to go out the gate, the crowds of Vietnamese at the gate made that impossible. They opened the gate, but I think at that point the pressure was so great that they immediately closed it.
As this scene took place in front of the embassy, Martin slipped out the back, picked up his wife, and made sure she was flown out of Saigon.
I did not have any feeling at that time. So I think that's the feeling of most of the Vietnamese at that time. So scared. So we had no more feeling. We felt numbed.
By late afternoon, helicopters carrying an additional security force arrived at the embassy. Marines ran through the compound and positioned themselves along the embassy wall.
The U.S. Marines in combat gear all along the wall and fences, using tear gas and using the butts of their rifles to push and shove and kick and stomp the Vietnamese back over the fence, back out into the streets again.
The only people we could take a chance on taking in were those who either had an American passport or a Western faith.
I had been mistaken many times in the previous 2 months for a Vietnamese. So I had this real fear that once I got to the top of the wall, the soldiers and Marines would simply push me back or kick me back, which is what they were doing to the Vietnamese. The only thing I could think of was that if I got to the wall and the Marines started kicking me back down, I was going to shout in perfect American English, "The Dodgers won the pennant."
Marines did not stop Kashiwahara, who scrambled over the wall and into the compound.
All during that period, there were telephone calls, radio calls still from people who were abandoned. You told me to meet you at this particular spot. Where are the Americans? The voices came in over the radios.
We finally got through, and the only thing that we knew and we heard at that time, painfully, was go, good luck.
We did try to take out all those to whom we had a very definite responsibility.
I felt a complete abandonment. I mean, here we are just not nobody off the street. We are part of the work.
They were the people who faced instant death if the communists should move on Saigon, as they did. And as a matter of fact, the proof of all of this is that when they moved on Saigon, one of the first places they went was the Saigon radio station. and they captured one particular announcer who had been left behind, a woman. They tied her to a tree, cut her tongue out, and let her bleed to death.
Hour after hour, helicopters continued picking up loads of evacuees. And as night fell, the choppers kept coming.
The weather began to deteriorate, as it often does near the water and the coast like that at night.
When we got in, started going in there, everything was just dark, except for the lights right there in the landing area. The responsibility that we had was to make sure that the plane was clear of all trees and everything, so we wasn't watching nothing else, just to make sure that when the plane came in for a landing, that it wasn't going to hit nothing.
And I think as the night went on, you saw more and more of these Vietnamese surrounding the embassy building. And I think one of my big fears was that one of the South Vietnamese, Arvin, might think he wasn't getting out and just crank a few rounds off at your helicopter.
To keep that from happening, the embassy security force patrolled the perimeter of the compound throughout the night as helicopters hovered over them.
The president was getting very agitated with Ambassador Martin and kept saying, when is he going to wrap this thing up? Ambassador Martin just kept asking for more choppers, more choppers, more choppers. Finally, the president said, you tell Ambassador Martin to get on that next chopper out of there, and that's it.
Ford's order went out on high-frequency radio. It read, the following message is from the President of the United States and should be passed on by the first helicopter in contact with Ambassador Martin. Only 20 lifts remain. Americans only will be transported. Ambassador Martin will board the first available helicopter, and that helicopter will broadcast Tiger, Tiger, Tiger once it's airborne and en route. The message was received by General Kerry.
Brigadier General Kerry came out, and at that time told us that the president said to bring the ambassador out on the next load. And we took off for the embassy.
When the helicopter landed, I was instructed by the pilot to ensure that the first person that got on was the ambassador himself.
He went downstairs, I think he jotted a little note down, went down to the ambassador, and the ambassador appeared in about 15 to 20 seconds with his entire entourage.
He seemed unusually frail as I lifted him up into the helicopter.
As we flew out over Saigon, I had a feeling of enormous relief. One could see the lights outlining the river. One could see one or two flashes of gunfire in the distance. But again, the feeling was one of sort of enormous relief that we had been able to avoid panic.
Martin arrived on the USS Blue Ridge suffering from what turned out to be pneumonia, and so hoarse he had lost his voice completely. The ambassador strode past reporters and headed for his cabin. In Washington, Henry Kissinger called a long-awaited press conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, our ambassador has left, and the evacuation can be said to be completed.
Kissinger, exhausted and relieved it was finally over, left the press conference to get dressed for a black tie dinner at the White House for Jordan's King Hussein.
Everybody was standing around in black tie. And I looked into Kissinger's office, and there he was, pulling a tie out of this paper bag.
What Kissinger did not know was that 10 Marines, the embassy security force, had not been lifted out. In fact, they had just begun closing down the embassy.
So we started moving into the embassy, and they all started charging at us, And we got to the door, and we had to sort of fight our way to get push some of those people out of the way, and finally close the big doors,
Everybody was smiling, and really it had gone very well. Something of that magnitude had been pulled off.
We sealed the doors, both doors, and we went up to the roof through the elevators, and then we locked the elevators up on the embassy roof. There were 2 doors up there that we also had to lock and put trash cans, wall lockers, fire extinguishers, anything to keep them from breaking up there,
As everybody was slapping each other on the back and congratulating one another, word came in that they had overlooked the final perimeter guards around the embassy. They neglected to remove them from the top of the embassy.
Instantly, a helicopter was dispatched, and at 8:35 in the morning of April 30th, the forgotten Marines were picked up. Juan Valdez was the last to get on board.
I no sooner set my foot on the ramp, and the ramp started going up on the helicopter. I slipped, and then one of the Marines grabbed me and just sort of pulled me inside. And we no sooner started hovering in the air, and then we noticed the Vietnamese had finally broken through that door, and they were already on the embassy roof. By that time, we'd already departed from there.
As the last chopper flew off, 420 fully processed, high-risk Vietnamese were left stranded in the compound, as other Vietnamese swarmed through the embassy, taking away everything the Americans had hurriedly left behind. There would be nothing of value remaining by the time the communist tanks rolled into Saigon 2 hours later and stormed the presidential palace. Nearly 7,000 Americans and loyal Vietnamese were evacuated that last day. The war was finally over. It was an ending perhaps best put by this cable the CIA sent to Washington just hours before. Wish to advise that this will be final message from Saigon Station. It has been a long and hard fight, and we have lost. Let us hope that we will not have another Vietnam experience and that we have learned our lesson. Saigon signing off.